right, good evening, everyone. Hello, and welcome to Food in the Garden and Cafeteria tonight. So I'm Susan Evans. I'm the program director here at the National Museum of American History for our American Food History Project. And we have moved ourselves inside due to weather, but for the past 3 weeks, we have been out in the beautiful Victory Gardens created by Smithsonian Gardens, who are our partner in this endeavor. So while we're not in the garden tonight, I do encourage you to come back 364 days of the year and visit both the Victory Garden here at the American History Museum and any of the other Smithsonian Gardens around the campus. And while you're there, be sure to take a guided tour by one of their horticulturists or garden docents. And more information about the garden tours can be found on their website, gardens.si.edu. So this year at Food in the Garden, we are exploring 4 waterways impacted by the War of 1812. We looked at Long Island Sound, Chesapeake Bay, and the Great Lakes earlier this month, and tonight we are closing out our series by exploring New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico. We're looking at the impact of the war on the waterways of these important regions and asking what is happening today around those waterways in terms of eating and growing. Food in the Garden is one of the many programs around food and food history that we do here at the museum, and we would truly love to hear your feedback on both this evening's program and any big ideas you have for future programs. And of course, you all have your phones out because it is completely socially acceptable to be telling your friends what a great time you're having using the hashtag Food in the Garden. And of course, this is meant to be a relaxed chat up here, so if you want to get up, get a second drink, maybe another praline, you are more than welcome to. We'll be here for about 20 minutes, and then we'll leave some time for questions, and then there'll be plenty of time for discussion and more people to chat with. We are definitely not going to cover 200 years of history in 20 minutes, nor will we attempt to. So I encourage you to continue the discussion, unless you guys want to, unless you want to try. We're on the clock.
But all right.
Before we get started, I want to give a special thank you to our generous supporters who made this evening possible. The Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts and DuPont. They are great partners who have supported our efforts to have conversations around how Americans understand themselves through our shared food history. I also want to thank the in-kind donors who have brought you the sips you're sipping and the food on your plate. You are enjoying cocktails made with DC's own Green Hat Gin and cider from Distillery Lane Cider Works. And our generous food supporter this evening is Wegmans, so a huge thank you to them. A special thank you this evening to our chef, William Bednar, who has made all of this delicious and historically inspired food. Exactly. We want to give him a huge round of applause for his work.
Beautiful.
Both tonight and for all of the food he's created for this series. It's truly been amazing. And I hear there is a special dessert coming out later too that will be pretty exciting too. And a huge thank you to the whole team that makes all of this happen. If you see anyone wearing a Food in the Garden apron, feel free to ask them all sorts of questions. They can totally handle it. So let's get started. All right. Most famously during the War of 1812, New Orleans is remembered for the Battle of New Orleans, when American forces led by Andrew Jackson, yes, indeed, that Andrew Jackson, handily defeated the British in 1815 after the war had officially ended. There's more information about the region during the war in your program, but beyond its role in the War of 1812, New Orleans has always been a crossroads of people, ideas, and products. At the heart of New Orleans are the people, a diverse population ranging from Native Americans to French, Spanish, Africans, and other waves of immigrants. So drawing from abundant natural marine resources and then adding diverse foods from around the world through merchants and settlers, the New Orleans population created one of the most unique and influential foodscapes in the world. The markets and new migrants continue to thrive and draw from the many unique cultural and natural resources of the area. So tonight we'll explore what was created out of this dynamic interplay of people and products at this global crossroads of New Orleans. So with us to discuss this and much more are David Guas. David is a New Orleans-born chef and owner of Bayou Bakery in Arlington. He is the host of American Grillers on the Travel Channel, where you may have seen him, and has garnered national praise for showcasing the soul of the South in his delicious Louisiana-style dishes and desserts. And if anyone had the pralines that were out on the table right behind you, he is responsible for those as well. which are incredible.
Yes, they're so incredible.
And Ashley Young, to his right, is a PhD candidate in history at Duke University and a research fellow and guest curator at the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans. Her dissertation, called Nourishing Networks, Provisioning Southern Cities in the Atlantic World, focuses on the transatlantic history of food markets and street food culture in 19th century American port cities. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, right? So Ashley, yes.
I will mention also, I've been on the board at SOFAB, Southern Food and Beverage Museum, for 5 years.
Oh, great.
So yeah,
I didn't see that.
we have a few
connection.
connections before we met here, but yes.
But then they are doing some really great work too. And if you don't know about the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, you should definitely look them up as well. They're really doing some groundbreaking, fascinating things about that whole region. So Ashley, can you start us off? Help situate us in early 19th century New Orleans. What were people eating and how were they getting that food?
I'd love to kind of bring in the historical context as much as I can for you. And so at our disposal, we have an amazing array of travel narratives from the 1800s that give us descriptions of the market, the people in the markets, how they sounded, the foods that were on display. And so in our historical arsenal, we really have a wonderful array of sources that we can turn to understand what people were eating in the markets. And not only what they were eating or what was being vended, but also what the markets sounded like, what the markets looked like. And an example I like to draw people in with is the description of sound. And sound is very important to help people understood the marketplace, because you might imagine 400, 500 vendors in the market calling out about fresh vegetables, fresh produce, prepared foods. And one of the most popular street vendor cries that I'm going to sample for you very quickly is the praline vendor cry. And these were sold mostly by enslaved African women in public marketplaces or in front of the cathedral in New Orleans. And they're very melodic, and you'll see that they have a melody to them almost like a lullaby, and you could easily harmonize with them, which is interesting. But you'll see, even in the melody and the melodic nature of these street cries, they're appealing to a certain audience, and that is children. Children who would have been playing in these marketplaces, and so they would hear this cry, give a few cents to the women, and walk away with a praline. So I will demonstrate that for you if I can, get my voice ready for that. So you see here.
Take a sip of your cocktail.
I know, I might take a sip of my cocktail. But it sounded like this. Pralines, pralines, for your sweet toothy, for your sweet toothy. Pralines, pralines. And so you can only imagine
Very nice.
that children would come flocking to these women. But it's just one example of the kind of soundscape of these cities, which I find interesting. But in the markets themselves, they would have had an amazing array of fresh waterfowl, duck, bear even. They were bringing in these Louisiana-based wild game into the markets. Seafood was paramount, obviously. New Orleans was a major port city, not only in the Atlantic world, but also because of its connection with the Mississippi River. So you have inland waterways as well as Atlantic waterways really influencing the food culture. So oysters, obviously, so important. Shrimp, I mean, if you've had Gulf shrimp, it's phenomenal. So you could have acquired all of these dishes. Like today in New Orleans, you could have had them in the early 1800s as well. So, and don't even get me started on the produce. But for those of you not familiar, the French market even had its own market just for bananas, because New Orleans was so tied to Latin America and the banana plantations there that they actually dedicated an entire pavilion to the sale of bananas.
Wow, that's so interesting. So then New Orleans food is so distinctive, and the food and culture are so tied together. David, can you tell us a little bit about, how would you describe New Orleans food culture in a couple minutes?
Yeah.
And how do you think and how do you think that came to be created?
Growing up in the city, like any kid, you sort of take advantage, or you you take for granted, where you're from or what's around you. It wasn't until I actually left New Orleans in '98, moved here, and I started writing a cookbook that I went back to the city and kind of refound my city and what it meant to me as an adult, and then relived some of my childhood through some of the iconic restaurants and spots that I grew up going to. Different bakeries were a big part of my upbringing, and of course all the famous sort of restaurants like Galatoire's and Antoine's and things like that we would go for special occasions. What I love seeing about New Orleans now, everything's kind of now post-Katrina. That's sort of our mark. Growing up in New Orleans, I've kind of put my chef hat on a little bit, and don't get me wrong, I absolutely adore the city. I think that what I love seeing now after the storm is this influx of new young chefs that are doing amazing things in that city. We don't want Galatoire's to change because that's part of our identity, our history, our culture of that city. We don't want Antoine's to change. We don't want Clancy's, some of these really small neighborhood restaurants, to ever change. And that's why the city fought so hard to sort of come back, is because we couldn't lose those, because then we'd lose ourselves. And that was what my book was about, is sort of what these places meant to us. And going back and now living here, going back there, they're that much more important to me, to ground me and to anchor me of those memories that I have of growing up in this city. But what I love seeing now is these chefs coming in that are doing innovative cuisine, and I'm not talking about molecular gastronomy, I'm just talking about different types of takes on foods that are embedded in history in the city, shrimp Creole, but done a little differently. So still taking advantage of the abundance of seafood right off our coast, but just presenting them in a different way, and maybe a different presentation, as opposed to a whole fish with a whole pound of jumbo lump crab meat smothered in Bernier sauce or something like that. Don't want that to change. But I don't want that to be on every menu of every restaurant.
Yeah.
So that's what I love, when I go back and eating at my friends' restaurants now that are, sort of that new generation, or, coming up in the city and have their own restaurants now. So I really enjoy the both ends of the spectrum right now. The city is really doing well, and I use all Louisiana seafood for the most part. I do take advantage of where I am in the Chesapeake, but a lot of my shrimp and of course my crawfish and everything come from Louisiana. We do boils during the summertime at the restaurant every Saturday, where we fly in 120 pounds of fresh live crawfish. And
can you talk about a boil? When you say a boil,
sure.
For some people who may have maybe never had a boil,
in New Orleans we boil everything. Very different than the crab situation here, and I've come to appreciate the steaming of crabs. So in fact, I actually prefer them that way now. Don't tell anybody or anybody back home. But we even boil our crabs in Louisiana. So boiled crabs, boiled shrimp, boiled crawfish. We just boil it, and it's easier that way. We throw a bunch of spices in it, and it picks up all that. But I like sort of the delicate aspect of steaming. But crawfish bowls, like any type of sort of ritual, sort of getting around the table, breaking bread, it goes back really, to obviously the Acadias and sort of how they were, exiled from, what now is Nova Scotia area and whatnot, and I think it was about 1755, but they obviously found their way, and those were the Cajuns, as we know it today. My aunt lives in Abbeville, Louisiana, which is about 3 hours west of New Orleans in Vermilion Parish, and that's where I was really exposed to there's the New Orleans way, and then there's the Acadiana way, and they are very different. And growing up in the city, being a city boy, I got to experience both. And so I try to bring a little of that sort of more Acadiana, sort of Vermilion Parish kind of way to my restaurant, especially when we do the boils. But we're talking potatoes, we're talking about yellow corn, sweet corn varietals. Obviously, sweet corn is a newer varietal of corn. Back then, it would have been white corn and not nearly as sweet as it used to be. So you weren't trying to preserve that sweetness because the sugars would turn so quickly. You pick corn, you'd have to eat it within a day. And so now we've got these different varietals that have a higher sugar content and they can last longer. But, you know, in my house, it was artichokes were thrown in there, andouille sausage, smoked sausage. It was just without hot dogs. I mean, just the whole refrigerator was going. So that's kind of the New Orleans version, but in different parts. And that's what it's supposed to be. It's a very personal thing. So it depends on what Dad wanted to throw in the bowl that day. But dump it out on a big table with the newspaper, and you get to town. There's a couple of rolls of paper towels, and there's some ice cold beer, and it's really where you just have conversation, because it's like picking crabs. It's the same thing. You know, you eat for 20 minutes to an hour, you clean up
Take
a little bit,
break.
you have another cold beer, your mouth starts burning and you're on fire, then you go right back to the table and start picking again. So, I mean, these things would happen. They'd be in batches. So, you know, every hour, another batch would be dumped on the thing, steam coming, everybody come back to the table. So it was an all-day affair, and that's what I love about it. It
And
forces
it's
us to slow down, you know?
It's such a tactile experience, too. I remember the first time I went to a crawfish boil, they said, watch out because the pads of your thumbs are going to be so sore for the next few days because you're peeling off the exoskeleton of the crawfish, and then you have people poking you and say, suck out the head, suck out the juice in the head, you know? And so it's certainly a communal experience.
Yeah, don't come to the table with any paper cuts or anything.
Yeah, I know. Some people, they put Band-Aids on their thumbs if they don't
prepare.
think they're up for the challenge of peeling off those exoskeletons. So
And in Louisiana, you know, the youngins would come to the table. Parents don't pick crawfish for little kids in Louisiana. It's something you learn right off the bat because it's a very sort of me, you know, even though it's very communal, it's, you know, so you teach them very early how to, you know, pick crawfish.
Survival of the best
Sure,
crawfish
of course.
picker. So it sounds like there's a lot of communal things, a lot of family stories involved. You talked about your aunt, which I think is great.
Aunt Boo.
Love
Janice Bourgeois.
Janice Bourgeois. Well, Bourgeois,
There you
French
go.
name. And you mentioned the Acadians too. So do you want to, Ashley, can you tell us a little bit about the Acadian group? And you know, you said the word Cajun, we also say the word Creole. What's going on there?
Here we are. You see?
Yeah,
I know, we always end up back here often.
And wait, so let me ask that a little differently. Should we talk about the difference between Cajun and Creole?
Yeah, I think we have to talk about the difference between Cajun and Creole. And often we associate the cuisine of New Orleans as a Creole cuisine, as it was in the 1800s through, you know, 20th century. And then some people argue that it was with, you know, Chef Paul Prudhomme that Cajun food really was brought to New Orleans. He was the one who made it on a national scale, bringing Cajun cuisine into haute cuisine and saying, we can have these fantastic dishes. You know, we can smother our rabbit, we can smother squirrel, and this can be something celebrated in a formal white tablecloth restaurant. But the history of it, as David was saying before, 1755, think of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. Acadians the British came in, they said, get out of Nova Scotia, get out of these northern provinces in Canada, and they migrated slowly through the Mississippi Valley down to what we now call Acadiana in Louisiana. And the cuisine there is completely different. It's a cuisine that, you know, it's built off the land. It's built off of affordable foods like crawfish, slow boiled, you know, slow flame, slow cooked, smothering techniques, and very different from the haute cuisine of New Orleans, which in the 1800s was more so French than anything else, because there was such a connection with France. Chefs in New Orleans were sent abroad to France to train, were brought back to Antoine's and other restaurants like that. And so those foods in the restaurants of New Orleans were not even, I would say, Creole in the sense that they weren't necessarily serving gumbo. They were serving French restaurant culture.
Yeah, I mean,
completely different.
the roux, sort of, you know, we always kind of come back to gumbo and roux. And
can you talk
like
about
Ashley
what
was
roux-
saying,
Can you talk about what roux is?
roux, yeah, I mean, it's a thickener. It's you know, it's the base to every stew sauce, you know, sauce piquant and etouffee and gumbo. And so in the French world, which would have been more the Creole side of New Orleans cuisine, it was with butter, you know, it's butter and flour. We say flour and fat is what we say in the South, but and then in the Acadia, it was, you know, butter was, you know, dairy products were just non-existent, so it was oil, you know, it was, you know, lard or, you know, and flour. So just those two alone, the differences, and also obviously the shades of color. You know, you're going to get the more French influenced, refined chefs that are doing blonder roux. softer in flavor, because there's a certain level you can't really take your butter. And then the oils and the flours of the Acadiana region from the Acadias would be more of a darker stewed ruse.
they
The other
cook
ones
it
were,
longer.
yeah,
The
New
flour
Orleans
would
was
get a
a
little
lighter,
toastier. Okay.
yeah, there were, you got the tomato, and the influences of okra and things like that, which they don't have there. And even in the Cajun cuisine today, you'll read recipes that call for white wine, but Aunt Boo will tell you that, Cajuns didn't cook with wine. We didn't have wine, we didn't have butter, and so he goes, that's, all the stuff that you guys do in New Orleans. So she's still sort of shouting out and claiming, keeping it as pure as possible
So
and
what
sort
did
of
she
reminding
use
people.
instead?
What's that?
What did she use instead if she wasn't using wine?
Well, acids. She uses a lot of citrus. Louisiana has a lot of citrus, a lot of oranges in certain parts outside of New Orleans, in Buras, as you're going down to Venice, Louisiana, where most fishermen would go out. Venice, myself included. That's where we would enter the mouth of the Mississippi. It's where great redfish were caught, and that's where you had the chance to go out in the Gulf right there as it opened up and go to the rigs and do big water stuff like wahoo and mahi dolphin and red snapper and just some tuna. Just an amazing. I mean, it's so abundant.
Yeah.
It still is today.
It's fascinating too because you mentioned roux, and so there's a saying in New Orleans: first you make a roux. That's the base of every Creole dish that you think of. But in the 1800s, 1700s, flour often spoiled in the transatlantic journey coming over to New Orleans. So originally, gumbos were not made with flour. Were not made with a roux until, well into the 1800s. And originally, they had to turn to Native American techniques using sassafras leaves, ground sassafras leaves, which we call filet, for example, to thicken those stews. Or they used okra coming from West Africa. It also has that slimy texture, a slimy quality that some New Orleanians and Louisianans love. They're absolutely in love with that texture, and it was a thickener. And so you see that there's an evolution in the cuisine.
Yeah.
And even though these dishes were French in some ways, in more ways they're West African, they're Caribbean. I mean, even the mirepoix of New Orleans, the Holy Trinity, it includes bell peppers. So you have celery, onion, and bell pepper. And the bell pepper was brought up from Latin America through the Caribbean. And it shows you how a French tradition, which would have used carrots instead of bell peppers, was transformed and adapted within the colonial context.
They call that sofrito. I mean, it's the same base to every peppers, onions, garlic. And so, even in Cuba, there's everything's sofrito. The parallels of Cuban cuisine to New Orleans are amazing. And I got to experience that firsthand 2 years ago when I went back to Havana. My father was born and raised in Havana, and we got to go back. It was his first trip back in 53 years. So the first dish that the chef taught me how to make in his own kitchen in Havana Vieja, the older part of the city, was identical to my shrimp Creole recipe, except instead of using shrimp, he was using spiny lobster, Caribbean lobster. And it was called langosta de enchilada. And it was a tomato-based. He even used a little wine, got a little fancy on me, and but sofrito, and then he had the lobster tail meat served with white rice. I mean, it's identical to my shrimp Creole. It was amazing. The other change is that they didn't have a lot of spice there, believe it or not. Even though a Caribbean island, it was not a heavy chili or spicy cuisine. Unlike Louisiana, we got the cayennes and the different peppers, and that was obviously our Central America sort of connection. And so that sort of cuisine became a little spicier, and then we were kind of known for that. So then we had to keep going up, and now sort of everybody expects that. Although Louisiana cuisine is not blow your head off spicy. That's why we have hot sauce on the table.
Yep, exactly. So. And their histories are entwined too. With Saint-Domingue, so what we now know as Haiti, with the Haitian Revolution, you can imagine 10,000 immigrants first came through Cuba.
Sure.
And they lived in Cuba. And then in 1809, 10,000 people came to New Orleans, doubling the population. And so we really kind of identify this period as the Francophile influence coming back into New Orleans and really bringing back these traditions from France, because they were both colonies at one time of France, although New Orleans, believe it or not, was under Spanish rule longer than it was under French rule. And the French Quarter today, historic architecture that you see there was actually of the Spanish era,
Sure.
not
All the wrought iron.
of the French era. So a common misnomer there, but it's something you really have to pay attention to the scent of Saint-Domingue and how those refugees were coming through Cuba, bringing those, red beans and use of red beans and whatnot into New Orleans. It's all connected. It's all connected in the Caribbean and the Atlantic.
So many connections and multiple stories and people coming from different areas. We should probably open it up for questions as well. There should be some folks with microphones. So does anyone, we could talk all day, clearly, which is great. But does anyone in the audience have a question for the panel they want to get after? All right, yes, in the back. Grab that too.
Oh.
We're having some microphone issues. So while we're figuring that out,
There we go.
okay, good.
Yeah.
There we go.
So long term, who do you think has a bigger impact, Prudhomme or Emerald?
What's that now?
Which chef do you think had a bigger impact or will have a bigger impact over time, Paul Prudhomme or Emerald Lagasse?
Hands down, Paul Prudhomme. Hands down. Emerald was our TV guy, but even going further back, and that's a great point because we look back at food. We have the nation has Julia Child to thank for so many things. An amazing exhibit here. We in New Orleans, before even Paul Prudhomme or during Paul Prudhomme's era, we had Justin Wilson. And Justin Wilson, if you don't remember, was on PBS television. I grew up watching him on Channel 12 in New Orleans, and he had that tagline, "I guarantee." And he had the big, thick red suspenders, and believe it or not, we were kin. And I found that out later in life, and he actually was the one that we set up and arranged a phone call one day, and I was on the fence of whether or not I was going to go to culinary school, and if it was, the right direction to go, or should I just launch right into my career and just get a job at a restaurant and just start cooking. And he connected me to a guy in New Orleans who had a culinary school, and it was a good friend of his. But I remember the conversation just like it was yesterday. And he grew up in Amite, Louisiana, which is where my grandmother was born and raised, right in Amite. And it's about an hour outside of New Orleans. And it was his mother was Olivet. And we just recently, my wife and I were driving through Amite on the way out of New Orleans and stopped by and got to see his house and where my grandmother was raised. So I would say Justin Wilson and Paul Prudhomme and John Folse, of course. You can't talk about Louisiana without talking about John Folse. Those were the pioneers, What's that? John Folse? He's in Thibodeau, and he's got a culinary school there, and he is just an amazing chef, and he's an amazing ambassador, and just sort of spews Louisiana. He's got these amazing cookbooks that are just absolutely just stunning photography, amazing recipes. They're for lack of a better word, they're coffee table books, but they are also ones, that you need to put some roux stains on because they're good. They're really good.
Great.
New Orleans has a very long tradition with food television. I've done some research on a woman named Lena Richard who had a cooking show called Lena's New Orleans Cookbook in 1950. And this is,
Wow.
15 years before Julia Child. And she was an African-American chef who was recruited by the Rockefeller family to cook in colonial Williamsburg, trained at the Fannie Farmer School in Boston, and came back to New Orleans where she opened up her own cooking schools, white tablecloth restaurants, and she was one of the first chefs and one of the first African-American women on TV. I mean, this is 1950, it's incredible. Unfortunately, the Skynacoke records of her show no longer exist, so we have to rely on oral histories and photographs to really get a sense of what she was making on television. But a huge impact on what was going on locally. Of course, these weren't nationally broadcast, but it was on WDSU TV.
There you go, WDSU.
It's still around today.
Still
well,
around.
not her show, but the station.
Yeah, of course.
All right, another question right in the middle here, and then another in the back.
Don't
This
call
one
him
now
that.
works.
Don't call him that. Okay. We're an equal opportunity question asker here.
Okay, so this is a question for Ashley. And this is slightly unfair because I've known her for a very long time. So David obviously has very strong ties to New Orleans as a city. I'm assuming you grew up there. Ashley, what inspired you to study New Orleans and specifically food pathways? Again, having known you very well. Second part to the question, how did your family's grocery store impact your thesis? Are there any modern implications that you're seeing through all of that?
Oh, excellent
So
question.
the question was about how Ashley, as a New Orleanian,
Dare I admit.
became interested in New Orleans, and I was pulling out there's a family story that involves a grocery store as well.
There is.
So what is the story there?
So I have two sides. I am the perfect marriage of my parents' interests. My father is a historian, and he was a teacher for high school students in world cultures and other American world histories. And my mother's business, which my mother now owns and operates with her two sisters, was started by my grandfather just after World War II. And he started as a vegetable stand operator on the side of the road on Christmas Eve, and eventually built up this business over time into
In Pittsburgh.
Pittsburgh into now we have 3 stores there, and they're gourmet grocery food stores. And so I have this interest in food, and I have an interest in history, but my ties to New Orleans go back to an internship that I had in 2009 as a collections intern at the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. And on the very first day, a colleague of ours, Liz Williams, introduced me to the Picayune's Creole Cookbook, and she said, "This is the cookbook you need to read to really understand New Orleans culture." And I opened up the pages of this cookbook and I started reading the introductory essay. And it had a history of Creole cuisine. And it, nodded to this transatlantic nature of Creole cuisine, ties to West Africa, ties to the Caribbean and Europe. But the racial prejudices embedded in these pages, the representations of African American women and women of African descent, caught me so off guard. I had never come across a historical document so rich with prejudice. It fascinated me, it troubled me, and it drew me to write a thesis about race and gender in New Orleans Creole cookbooks from turn of the century, 1884 to 1905, essentially, when they were first published. So that's how that all began. But for implications for today, I study public market culture, and they don't really exist in many cities. Some of them are being revived. Some, like the French market, have existed for over 200 years. But we have farmers markets today, and these are iterations of the public market culture, right? And we have a fascination with good food. We want to know where our food is coming from. We want to know our farmer. But in the 1800s, your farmer was your next door neighbor. You knew them. It was just a community there. And each public market in New Orleans, they had 33 of them, 33 neighborhood markets. Each one catered to the ethnic community of that market. So everything was tailored specifically to the the consumption interests of that particular community. And you can think nowadays as we're facing food security issues, hunger, obesity, can we learn something from the 1800s? Is there a seed of inspiration in how public markets were run there, or how street food culture operated, that might provide insights or perhaps a potential solution for issues that we're facing today? I'm hoping that in some ways my dissertation will be informative for public health individuals who are working in these sectors, but it's a difficult question and something
David,
that we're trying to
Just for
find
the record,
solutions.
she still cheers for the wrong black and gold. I'm assuming you're a Steelers fan.
I am a Steelers fan, but who
But
dat?
black and
I'm just
gold,
saying.
maybe that was the draw. Black and gold in New Orleans. Black and gold. Anyway,
So how would
it's
you
all about
say-
football.
In New Orleans, there
That's
we go.
right.
Well, first of all, I want to point out that she said in order to understand New Orleans culture, you have to read a cookbook.
Yeah.
Which is really an amazing just way of tying it all together. But David, how are you impacted in the work you do by some of the history of the city you come from in that market system? And has any of that impacted what you're doing?
Yes, it's influenced it. Of course, for me, getting back to knowing your vendor, where your product comes from, it got really trendy about 10 years ago with chefs, and it's really just a full circle. And I don't necessarily think it's something that should be promoted or used as a marketing tool. I think it's an obligation. And for me, honestly, what it is it's fulfilling. So, what I do and the hours that I put in and the sacrifices that myself and my family makes to do what I love to do. We were talking about this. From an academia sort of background to our industry, yes, certain networks have made what we do and glorified it to our advantage, and then also there's some negative aspect to sort of the TV world and what it's done for our community and our industry. But if I didn't know where something was coming from and I wasn't able to go see what they do, we went out to Purcellville 2 weeks ago to visit where all our mustard, all of our greens come from. We purchase from a farm that's got a Vienna farm, but it's also the main farm is in Purcellville. It's a Potomac vegetable farm, and we have a relationship with the farm managers, and we ended up going out there and cooking for their entire crew right on the farm. We had a little Weber grill, and it's about relationships. That's what obviously it's about product first, but for me, it's a very selfish, if I can't connect with them and know what they do, and it's not the same kind of mission statement that I have, the parallels have to be there. We have to have the same goals, the same reason for doing what we do. And these guys are sleeping on the farm, some of them, because they love to farm. Yeah. They make their own compost. A lot of people buy their compost. These guys are amazing. And to learn more about how they do things in their operation and what sets them apart from other farms and the cover crops that they do just to throw it back into the soil, and how they care for their soil like you would care for like a new baby. It's just, to see someone else's passion, it's infectious. Yeah. And so you have that energy after leaving the farm, and you have that energy in your space and in your restaurant, and you attempt to have that kind of sort of move around, and the energy is sort of shared. But for me, I just do it so that I can sleep well at night, knowing what I'm giving my customers, and I think. It's just, like I said, it's sort of an obligation that we have, not something, and it's nothing new. Yeah. Let's just remember that. There's nothing new about what I'm doing or anybody else should be doing as far as having a relationship with their farmers. It's about as old as it gets.
All right, we have time for a couple more questions, Paula. And speaking of family,
Speaking of family, I'm from New Orleans, so of course I'm going to have a very hard question. No, but I do want to add to yours about Paul Prudhomme or Emeril. There's a person that we shouldn't forget that was very influential in the Caribbean cuisine and the influences, Leah Chase.
Oh, sure.
A woman. And I think she is someone that was very instrumental in that cuisine and developing that cuisine and us learning about gumbo zerb and stuff like that.
Well, the list is long, but I couldn't.
Pardon?
No, that's perfect.
So I wanted to say that, but I do have a question for you which intrigued me, which I'm trying to research the history. You talked about the bananas and having in the French market that there was a designated area for just bananas. And is it true, I understand that New Orleans was the port, most importantly for bringing bananas into this country through the Gulf Coast. Do you mind, Ashley, explaining a little bit about that if you do know?
So some questions about the trade of bananas, how they moved, and really how bananas got to America. And now, of course, in every grocery store, every corner store, but not grown here. So what's the New Orleans story with that?
Exactly. I think there's some statistic out there that's saying bananas are the most popular fruit consumed in the United States today, if I'm not mistaken.
I'll buy that.
I would buy that.
But the banana republics, have a very complicated history tied to slavery. Mm-hmm. These are largely along Central, Latin America and whatnot. So they would have been grown in Latin America, brought en masse ships through the Caribbean. You have that Caribbean connection. Some of these ships would have diverted to Saint-Domingue. They would have gone to Cuba. But most of these ships would have come to the port of New Orleans. And then either through railroad or going up the Mississippi after we had some steamboat, innovation of the steamboat that could go upriver, these bananas were then transported to the rest of the United States. And it's really important to bring in transportation history here, particularly with the railroads, because it transformed how we grow produce in the United States. Prior to that, farms would have specialized not in one crop, not monoculture, but many crops, unless you were in a typical southern plantation system where you were doing cane sugar or cotton. But most small-scale farms had numerous kinds of fruits and vegetables. California is similar. But once you had the railroad system in place, you could ship a single commodity crop from the West Coast to New Orleans, to New York, and it created a culture of monoculture, completely transforming the ways that people actually farmed.
Grow food.
And of course, we didn't adapt bananas in the United States because they wouldn't grow very well here, and we depended on those banana republics to feed our consumption habits. But yeah, just an interesting thing to bring in transportation history as well into the
And
the
if you
fold.
go through the Garden District or a lot of places in New Orleans, you know, banana trees, even though they're not grown for their crop, is, you know, a big part of the landscape there. And so, you know, obviously with the subtropical climate that we have in New Orleans, you can grow some beautiful, lush. I mean, the gardens. Talk about the gardens. It's just amazing. If you haven't been there, you know, there's just some amazing gardens. So.
Yeah, and by 1850, the Port of New Orleans was the 4th largest port in the world. It wasn't even in the United States. There were so many products coming through the Port of New Orleans. And like I said, they were using both Atlantic trade routes, but then also these inland trade routes because of the connections with the Mississippi. So New Orleans is just so central. It's a huge city by the mid-19th century.
Wow. All right, we have one more question over here, and then we're gonna make way to dessert, which is also coming. So one more question. No, take your time.
Thank you. I
Ooh, that'll wake you up.
close to the speaker. Let me back up. There. From away from the speaker, I think it'll help.
I think you're okay.
Okay. I've been noticing in Northern Virginia that there are a number of crawfish boil restaurants opening up, and a number of them, the ones that I've been to, all seem to be owned by Vietnamese families. And I'm wondering if there's a connection between the Vietnamese people who moved into Louisiana and started fishing and the crawfish that's coming up into Northern Virginia into these restaurants.
So some restaurants in Northern Virginia, crawfish restaurants, crawfish boil restaurants, owned by Vietnamese families, and then of course Vietnamese migration into New Orleans, huge part of the story related to fishing and agriculture and all sorts of movement of people. So is there a relationship there
Sure.
between where we are and New Orleans?
I mean, you know, yeah, I mean, the connection of the Vietnamese in Louisiana and in New Orleans is obvious. I mean, it's huge. When I grew up, I grew up in the eastern part of New Orleans East, and, you know, half a mile to a mile closer to Slidell or to the 5 Mile Bridge or to the Pontchartrain was an area like Bullard and Michoud and where NASA was, and that was a very large, you know, shrimping community. So my area was thick with, rich with culture, and we had Vietnamese, African American, and that was just a part of the city that was just a working community, and heavily influenced by the shrimp community and the Vietnamese. A lot of Vietnamese restaurants down Chef Mentor Highway towards Chalmette. And so, you know, I didn't think anything of it. You know, I mean, I was just
Just what it
spoiled.
was.
I've grown up eating Vietnamese cuisine since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. And now, what's interesting in New Orleans, a friend of mine, you know, a 40-year-old Caucasian male, just opened up a Vietnamese restaurant, had 10 years training with a very famous chef down in New Orleans, John Besh, and he broke away from John and opened a place called Mofo. And it is his take on trying to celebrate you know, the influence of the Vietnamese community and population on food, and bring his sort of more modern technique and cuisine to he's in Mid-City right now and has been open about a year and just got a big award from Esquire magazine and is doing really well. But it's, I mean, why not? I mean, that's what New Orleans is why not, you know?
I love that you brought up Mofo. So I had friends visit me in New Orleans when I was doing my dissertation research last year, and I took them to Mofo. And I took them
There you go.
to several Vietnamese restaurants because New Orleanians, when I first came, they said, you have to try banh mi. You have to try pho. It is a part of New Orleans culture now. You may not call it exactly Creole food, but it's definitely part of Creole culture to
Oh,
the
yeah.
point where people say, you have to have
Yeah.
this. We need to go to the New Orleans East Farmers Market at 5 a.m. to the Vietnamese Farmers Market, or we have to go across the bridge to this particular
Some
place.
of the best produce in the entire city.
Yeah, for their banh mi. I mean, it is just so integrated into the culture now.
So I love that that story has continued, of course, throughout history. That we started this whole discussion with banana stalls in a market, and have really
Sure.
continued to how New Orleans is continuing to change, continuing to evolve today as well.
But just, I don't know why here, you know, why Northern Virginia? I mean, like, you know, why am I here? I mean, you know, so I don't know if it necessarily was any kind of migratory sort of specific reason why. I'm assuming you're talking about a couple of restaurants like Chasing Tails and things like that. You know, and it's interesting because everybody has their take on how to prepare crawfish. They do it differently than I do, but apparently I don't know them very well, and I've heard, you know, their connection to Louisiana, and I know they have a couple of people, behind the sort of the ownership of the restaurant. But they sort of toss it in different so it's a little more modern and almost like a buffalo wing place where they've got different flavors, if you will, and which is fun, and that's, again, why not, and I don't do mine that way, but it's to each his own, so but there are quite a few, out at Eden Center and things like that. So I love that we have more crawfish in the city. I hope they're getting them from Louisiana.
And I think food history, it's a history of diaspora, really. It's about communities. Obviously you can study a community that is isolated, which we know is a very controversial term, but people are constantly moving. They're taking their cultures with them. They're meeting new cultures. You're creating hybrid cultures. And I think this is an example of that kind of diasporic food culture that is so brilliant to study as a historian or even a chef. Yeah. I mean, that's really where inspiration for your meals comes from. They're
Sure.
vibrant cultures that are just rich with so many histories.
I mean, you know how it feels to be in your own kitchen and to finally tackle a recipe that, somebody before you in your family used to do, or, you're carrying along this recipe as this story and passing it down. I mean, there's not too many other things, that we ingest that don't necessarily, well, it's not an heirloom in the sense, but when you have these written recipes, my grandmother, when she passed, I received all of her cookbooks, and you talk about the River Roads volumes of the cookbooks, and of course the Creole cookeries and different volumes of cookbooks that I got, and to be able to thumb through those books and to see like your grandmother's handwriting in the margins. We were looking through one recently, and it just was pretty blunt, but she said, this recipe is not good. Don't, it was a note to herself because, she flipped through it constantly, and she was a wonderful entertainer, and she had this great exposure to Cuban cuisine living there for 18 years and raising my father and his brother. So she came back to New Orleans with even more in her sort of Rolodex as far as recipes, and I got to sort of secure those, and that to me is what food is. It's stories, and the feeling you get, is really, you can't compare it to much else.
It's true.
After eating it or taking that first bite and sort of just transcending and remembering, that moment when you first had that from the person who made it for you. So
I think everyone here must have those kind of connections. Like I have my grandmother's cast iron skillets, and when I make a pineapple upside down cake or whatever in that skillet, it shapes the way you think about it.
See, black and gold. You're back
to
to black and gold.
I tell you what. But I mean, it really is. It's about family. It's about connections, memory. I mean, we're really constructing our own narrative here with our family histories, but that doesn't mean they're any less important or significant. And, that's what I study in the 1800s. That's what chefs are bringing to the table today.
Yeah.
It's about family. It's about your connections and how you imagine yourself. In an inconceivable world, we try to draw these networks to kind of understand ourselves and our identity. So,
well, and that is why we love having groups like this here together tonight in our own kind of community to talk about these things and learn about what's happening both in our communities around the country and as part of a global story of what's always been happening here. So with that, I want to give a huge thank you to our panel.
Thank you.
And to let you know that the night is not over. There is still plenty of time for discussing with the folks up here. Also visiting with people in our marketplace area. We have coffee roasting demos from Chesapeake Bay Roasting Company, some heirloom rice presentations from the American History Museum. Capital City Company is here to talk about hot sauce and mumbo sauce in DC. We have a cocktail historian, Philip Green, who's here, who is doing some cocktail. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Some of the
Thank
drinks
you,
on
Philip.
stage. And he'll also be signing his book, To Have and Have Another, a Hemingway Cocktail Companion.
I also have my book over
David
there.
will be here. David will be out signing his book, which is also for sale. And James Gagliardi of Smithsonian Gardens will be signing the Encyclopedia of Garden Plants, which is hot off the presses. And Smithsonian Garden staff will also be here to talk about the work they do at the museum and in the community. And on top of all that, we also have a special dessert that our chef has been making fresh for all of you. So I won't hold you back from your beignets anymore. Exactly. So thank you all for coming to Food in the Garden for this entire season, and we hope to see you back in the garden next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, fantastic.